and we send each other pictures of it. But she says it has to be if you went out of your way and you walked a different way and then you saw them. If it's like, the normal way that you go or somewhere that you know that they exist, that doesn't count. It has to be if you went out of your way. So I had a previous thing with Robin, which was about the figure of 8 or the infinity symbol. And there's a story in the book of how that was cropping up for me when I actually met him. But there was a day recently where I had 3 spaced out meetings in the day. So I thought I'll take the opportunity to walk for an hour between them all. Mm-hmm. And for the last meeting of the day, I ended up walking past UCH, which is the University College Hospital, where he was having treatment. And that had been a really traumatic time for me when he was in hospital there. And I will have to say I kind of avoided that area since then. I'll tell you about a particular story that was like really traumatizing for me. So on this walk to where I was going for the evening for a book launch event, I ended up walking past the hospital. And I actually said in my head, like, why would you make that happen to me? Like, why do I have to walk past that building? I never want to see that building again in my life. And again, I said, you have to send me a sign. And by the time I got to Euston Station, so, people who don't know can Google this, it's not very far. There was an elastic band in the figure of H lying on the pavement, and that means something to me. So the thing about this confirmation bias thing is it's dependent on the reticular activating system, which is the system of your brain that filters out what's not crucial to your survival and filters in what it wants you to notice. And so actually, one of the things I've written about in the book is the art of noticing. Because really, we live in this world where life is passing you by at 100 miles per hour. You're not noticing things that could actually be crucial to you thriving rather than you just surviving. And in this model called shared trait vulnerability, which falls under the field of research called neuroaesthetics. So basically, creativity is a positive personality trait, right? Mm-hmm. But there is a high correlation between creativity and psychopathology, which is mental illness, particularly depression, schizophrenia, and alcoholism. And there are quite a few high-profile examples of creative people who had mental illnesses, like Alexander McQueen, Kurt Cobain, Van Gogh. So what that shows is that there's an area of overlap of 3 particular ways of thinking that are underpinned by neurology that are the reasons that people with mental illness are so creative. And they are basically hyperconnectivity. So that's 2 things. That's joining the dots in the material world of things that aren't obvious to other people. But it's also hyperconnectivity inside the brain. So if you think about all these lobes, so heavy. If you think about all these lobes, the more lobes that are firing at the same time, and there's also a cortex that's known as the association cortex. So that one, these lobes can be firing, but they're not necessarily connecting up with each other. The more interconnected all this firing is in the brain, the more the brain opens up to new ideas. Mm-hmm. And so that underpins creativity. And also this usually really involves the visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobes. And that's why sometimes people, whether it's through psychedelics or, sort of altered states of consciousness through creativity can see things that they didn't see before. Mm-hmm. There's also something called novelty salience, which is noticing new things or just noticing things of importance that you would otherwise have filtered out. And there's something called attenuated latent inhibition or low latent inhibition, which is to do with that filter. And it means that the filter allows more things in than it normally does. Mm-hmm. So you can see we've got hyperconnection, we've got noticing more things, and we've got the filter like loosening and allowing more things in. Now, if you've got a high IQ, high working memory, and you've got cognitive flexibility, which is you can think, out of the box, that's a really good thing. If you've got a low IQ, you've got deficits in your working memory, and you've got what's called perseveration, which is you just go over the same thought process over and over again, that can lead to you having a psychological crisis. So I took that model and thought, if grief is like psychosis and I'm currently in a very vulnerable state, is creativity a conduit for me to get not only back to the state that I was in before, but into a state of expanded awareness where I can loosen the filter as I choose fit. I can notice things that I would have passed by before, and I can think differently about how my mind works, how the world works, possibly what happens after someone passes away. And then I went and, looked into near-death experiences and terminal lucidity and dark retreats. Like I said, I went down a rabbit hole.
And what did you find in that rabbit hole?
At the border of life and death, usually within 1 to 24 hours of death, someone whose brain hasn't been functioning, who can't remember the names of their own children, suddenly becomes completely lucid and says, "Stephen, darling, come over here. Let's have a nice mother-son chat." And then that gives a lot of people hope, but usually that means it's an hour or 23 hours till the person's going to die. We can't explain that. How can a brain that's irreversibly damaged suddenly function completely normally? There is no explanation for that. With the near-death experiences, I was particularly compelled by 3 stories. Dr. Mary Neal, an orthopedic surgeon, she's in that Netflix documentary, Surviving Death. She was submerged underwater for 15 or 20 minutes. She should never have been able to be resuscitated. She describes her whole journey of going to another realm, seeing, a being of light, being told that her life isn't over. She has to turn back and return to the physical world, even though she could see her bloated body and her friends trying to reach her to resuscitate her, and they couldn't. Dr. Eben Alexander, who wrote Proof of Heaven, he is a doctor. He was an atheist. He was in a coma with bacterial meningitis and was pronounced clinically dead, and then basically came back and said that he saw heaven, and he now believes in a God that is benign, that cares about the future of humanity. So for me as a doctor, hearing these stories from other doctors was really, really convincing. And then there's one story that Dr. Bruce Grayson told me. He's a professor of psychiatry at University of Virginia, who has done 50 years of research into near-death experiences. And he told me the story of a patient in ICU who kept going into cardiac arrest. And he had a primary nurse who was a young 20-year-old nurse, and they had a really close bond. And one weekend, she had time off for the weekend, and he had a different nurse looking after him. And he went into cardiac arrest and he had a near-death experience. And in that near-death experience, he saw his primary nurse. She said to him, "Your life isn't over. You have to go back and get better. And please tell my parents I'm sorry about the red MG." So he wakes up in ICU. He's got this replacement nurse looking after him. And he says, the strangest thing just happened. I had this experience of being in this other world. I saw my primary nurse, and she said I had to come back. And she also said, tell my parents sorry about the red MG. So the temporary nurse bursts into tears, runs out of the room. He has no idea why. Someone comes in and says, what's just happened? He explains, and they tell him that his primary nurse was given a red MG for her 21st birthday, took it out for a test run, crashed it into a tree, and died. Now, he didn't know she was dead, but he saw her on the other side, and she told him to come back.
And the guy that told you this story was who, relevant to the patient? Who said that?
Dr. Bruce Grayson. He has done 50 years of research on near-death experiences. He's got over 5,000 recorded cases of patients of his own that he's looked after that have had near-death experiences. And he also shared with me the numbers of cases that other people have on databases. So, we're looking at over 10,000 cases globally recorded at the moment.
What is it that you believe, based on those near-death experiences, like the red MG story, and based on this phenomenon of terminal lucidity?
So Professor Alexander Bathiani, who wrote Threshold about terminal lucidity, put it really nicely when he said, maybe at the border of life and death, we see something that is true all along, but we don't, for whatever reason, see it or acknowledge it whilst we're alive and well, which is that the mind and body can operate independently of each other.
It is quite shocking. There's this case from 2009, an 82-year-old woman with Alzheimer's disease who was non-verbal and non-responsive and had no apparent recognition of her surroundings or families for years. And then one day before her death, she suddenly sat up in hospital, looked around and recognized her daughter by name, spoke clearly, reminisced about the past, thanked her family for caring for her. Her speech was coherent, her memory was intact, and her personality recognizable, as though she had never been ill. She fell asleep that evening and died peacefully during the night. And what do you think's happening there? What do you think's happening there?
It's possibly, partially explained by a surge in neurochemicals, but it's not explained by how can those neurochemicals act if the physical neurons and synapses are damaged. There is no explanation. The only explanation is that the mind is not emergent from material matter. It's not the mind, the thoughts, the emotions, the psyche cannot be solely emerging from physical matter. That's the only explanation from what we understand so far.
And so what is it that you now believe? You believe that our souls and our bodies are two separate things. Mm-hmm. And where does our soul live if it's not living inside of me? Mm-hmm. So where is Robin? Mm.
So I believe that, whether you want to call it the universe, consciousness, collective consciousness, Godhead, cosmic soup, the word for it isn't important. There's somewhere that energy goes and it still exists in some form. And if you believe in reincarnation, then you may believe that it then enters another body as a vessel and, has a different life. But it doesn't go away.
How do you know?
I'm going to say something that I know you're not going to like, but I know because I feel it personally. I feel it like with the person I've been closest to in my entire life, who I know would never leave me if they didn't absolutely have to. But I can back that up to the extent of I can say you can't prove that this isn't true. I can back that up with everything that I put in the book. And I'm not the only one. Dr. David Eagleman at Stanford says, this idea of the brain being like a radio and receiving signals from outside, we can't prove it, but we categorically cannot say it's not true. Professor Donald Hoffman suggests that space-time is not the basis of how the universe works, suggests that consciousness is the basis of how the universe works. We can't prove that's not true. And I find that really exciting. I mean, as a scientist, you're supposed to challenge the status quo. You're supposed to be curious. You can't, as a scientist, believe that everything we know now is all there is. There's no point to being a scientist if that's what you believe.
I asked you this question about the gym earlier on about, is it kind of like training in the gym? Are there things you think people could do to heighten their ability to speak to loved ones that might have passed or to heighten their ability to tap into signs?
So I go through this in the book and I chose the order quite carefully. So I talk about neuroaesthetics, which is, noticing beauty basically, if not like actually engaging in the arts. There's a lot of evidence for engaging in the arts in terms of increasing your novelty salience, which is noticing new things, which is part of the journey of opening up that filter. Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole chapter on nature, because I think a lot of signs come from nature, like butterflies, robins, spiral formations, cloud formations. So noticing nature more can help you, also to receive these signs. And then community is a huge part of it, because if I had this conversation with you and you totally shut me down and said, it's not provable, this is ridiculous, I'm not airing this episode, that would have a very different effect on me to you even being open to asking me challenging questions that I welcome, but also engaging in this conversation and sort of, maybe feels a little bit like maybe questioning, some things that you might do differently. So those are three very important parts of part two of the book. Part one is more about what are signs, what are you missing, have you been receiving signs already?
One of the things that when I was going through my sort of transition from being religious to being agnostic, I'd say, because I wouldn't call myself an atheist, is I was watching all these atheist minds debate and talk and stuff. And one of the things one of them said is that if coincidence didn't happen in our lives, then that would be a miracle. Like statistically, mathematically, if at some times you don't think of Dave and then the phone rings and it's Dave, that would actually be more mathematically improbable than it happening sometimes. If you think about, if you had this on a distribution curve or something, it is likely mathematically that really unlikely things will happen sometimes.
Okay.
Right. So I've always had that in my head as a way to sort of rationalize coincidence. So when coincidence happens, I think, well, probabilistically, really unlikely things have to happen. And if they never happen, then that's a miracle.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Like mathematically, you would say likely things happen often, unlikely things happen less often, extremely unlikely things happen way less often.
Yeah.
That's like the nature of maths, right?
Yeah.
So when extremely unlikely things happen, I say, actually, that makes sense because probabilistically those things happen infrequently. They're not happening every single day. Like right now, I'm thinking of, I can name 10 people. I guarantee when I go to my phone, none of those 10 people have texted me. But if I do that every day, one day, I'm going to say, hey, Steve, checking in. Which makes sense because of the laws of probability.
But I don't want you to do that. I want you to just be open to naturally thinking of someone and seeing if that does happen, or, or asking for a sign and seeing if it comes into your life. That's all I'm asking. Just try it. It's not going to hurt you. And I'm not just saying that to you. I'm saying it to everyone.
And how do you think that would benefit me?
I think it makes you believe in something bigger than yourself.
Yeah. And why is that so important?
Because I think a life where all you're trying to do is get through and meet your needs life can be better than that. I think a life where you feel more connected to yourself, to others, to something greater, gives you purpose. There's a lot of research that shows that having a purpose that transcends just yourself is actually really healthy and important.
And what is that for you now, that transcendent layer in your life? How do you define it? Is it a religion? Is it something else?
It's definitely not religion. I guess it's spirituality and, a form, which will mean different things to different people. It's definitely about caring for humanity. Is it a God? A creator? For me, no. But 85% of people globally believe in religion and a God, so it's important. I think for me, it's about giving a voice of relevance and helping people to feel seen and heard, because I think that's very lacking. And, I'm in the enormously privileged position that you have given me of being able to do that, and I want to use that in a really positive way. How does this overlap with or sit alongside what people call intuition? Because you talk about that as well in the book. Yeah. I know there's so much, there's still so much else that I want to say. Just keep going. So intuition is what it is. It's accessing inner wisdom, right? But I've included it as a really important part of the book because I believe that it's a way to receive and interpret your signs. But I just want to go back to something I said earlier, which is about how trauma can be stored in your body. And, to some extent, it can't be retrieved through talking therapy because there aren't words for it, because it's actually embedded into the tissues of your body. There's a really exciting new hypothesis for how that might work called the serotonin hypothesis. So previously, I think it would make sense that if, for example, when Robin was in hospital, I would sit in a very hunched over position and my fists would be clenched because I felt like I was fighting for his life all the time. And if I relaxed for a millisecond, he could die. So it makes sense to me that those postural issues would show up for me later in terms of aches and pains and, perhaps not perhaps, as my Pilates and yoga teachers keep telling me, issues with, certain parts of my spine and stuff. But the serotonin hypothesis is very exciting as a neuroscientist because a lot of people have heard of Bessel van der Kolk's work and the book The Body Keeps the Score. And it makes sense kind of intuitively that the body does keep the score. And like I've said, there's an amount of trauma that you can't express, you can't articulate verbally. So we understand that there are imprints of that in the body. Mm-hmm. But we've never really understood how that works. And I've talked before, I think with you, about intuition through a process called Hebbian learning, which is neurons that fire together, wire together, gets pushed deeper and deeper into neurons from the outer cortex, the limbic system, the brainstem, into gut neurons. And that's why intuition is called gut instinct. And we understand that through stress postures, you could have bracing patterns in your muscles for like the trauma that you've experienced. Fascia is the connective tissue that holds your entire body together, all your organs, all your muscles. And until fairly recently, fascia was thought of as a vestigial organ. It was cut away in surgery without thinking of that it would have any effect on the rest of your body. Now it's understood more to actually be an organ of its own and an important one. And the serotonin hypothesis goes some way to explain how the level of constriction of capillaries and the amount of nutrients that's released to skin, fascia, and muscle is a mechanism for how trauma is held in the body.
And with that in mind, what do we do to get rid of that trauma held in the body?
Physical activities. So dancing, singing, drumming, humming, chanting, massage, yoga, craniosacral therapy. And you'll notice like the ones I started with are, very related to ancient wisdom. So our ancestors knew this. For example, in ancient Greek burials, they would wail and beat their chests. So they were getting rid of grief by like screaming, but also by beating their muscles and letting like trauma exit their body.
I'm very well aware that there's probably a lot of people who have sent this conversation to a friend who is struggling right now. Mm-hmm. And that friend who has lost a loved one, potentially a husband, potentially a wife, potentially, God forbid, a child or a grandparent or something, is listening to this because they are in search of answers for their own healing. Mm-hmm. You've been there. Mm-hmm. You may still be there in some degree. If you were to advise them on